Hi, I'm Sam Hawley, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Before we get into today's episode, I wanted to let you know we're doing a listener survey and want to hear from you about how you've found the show this year and how we can make it even better. It's short, anonymous, and you can find the link in our show notes. Now for today's episode of ABC News Daily. We've had 7 months of successive interest rate rises as the Reserve Bank tries to slow out of control inflation. But is it working yet? And when will the rate hikes stop? Today, the ABC's business editor, Ian Verrender, on how there are finally signs consumers are spending less and why the RBA is now playing mind games. Ian, Philip Lowe, the head of the Reserve Bank, he gave an address in Hobart last week after jacking up interest rates again.
Good evening,
and it seems like he really doesn't like inflation.
No, he doesn't like inflation. He called it an evil and a scourge.
It's a scourge on our society. High inflation devalues your savings. It worsens income inequality in our society.
And essentially laid out the reasons as to why the Reserve Bank at the moment and every other central bank in the world is really clamping down on trying to get inflation back under control.
Is that interest rates will need to go higher still. We need to bring inflation back to target, and that I think will require higher interest rates, and our forecasts have been prepared on that basis. If we need to step up to larger increases again to secure a return of inflation to target, we will do that.
Really, the only real weapon they've used until now is rising interest rates. But we're now at a point where rates are at their highest level in pretty much a decade, and it's happened in a very, very short space of time.
So his message is basically inflation is scary. How do we, Ian, measure inflation? How do we know what level it's at? How do we know it's going up so quickly?
Yeah, look, it's an interesting question, really, because they've become quite sophisticated at the way they do measure inflation. And what inflation is, it's the speed at which prices are rising. So it doesn't, measure how expensive things are. It measures the speed at which prices are going up. They actually go physically into supermarkets to measure prices. They look at, they have surveys of businesses. They do, it's quite a comprehensive system and survey. What happens is, let's say the price of apples goes from $1 to $2. Well, that's 100% inflation. But if it stays at $2 for the next period, that's zero inflation. And so you've wiped out inflation because the prices aren't rising, but they're still very expensive.
Okay, so we can see the Reserve Bank is continually lifting interest rates to bring down inflation. So people have less money in their pockets to spend. Those interest rate rises, are they working?
It depends what you mean by working. It takes a long time for interest rates to work their way through the system and start to have the impact that they're designed to do. And, ultimately what they're designed to do, as you just said, is to take money out of people's pockets so that they have less to spend. And that means when there's less money chasing the same amount of goods and services, the prices don't rise as quickly, because you've got more goods and services out there than there is money chasing it. And that's how you slow inflation down. But it takes quite a while for that to work its way through the system. It takes pretty much a year. Now, if you had a central bank like ours, the Reserve Bank, that had pushed through, say, 3 or so in a year, 3 rate hikes, 3 or 4, they'd be sitting back going, we better just hold off on this to see what kind of impact this is going to have. We've just pushed through 11, essentially, the equivalent of 11 rate hikes since May. So that is a cracking pace.
So is there any signs at all, Ian, that we're spending less after these 11 rate rises.
Yep, and it depends, though, how you look at the spending figures. I mean, we had retail sales come out just a couple of weeks ago, and they were hugely elevated from the same time last year. But if you look at them from a month-to-month basis, you can see that they are starting to taper off. So yes, it is starting to have an effect. People are starting to feel the impact, particularly people with mortgages. They're starting to feel the impact of less money in their pockets, and they're starting to wind it back. And the other big measure, I guess, is that, everyone from the banking chief executives to the Reserve Bank head to government have all said and highlighted this wonderful buffer that we have in place, where there was so much savings accumulated during the pandemic with people unable to spend, that this is going to allow us to ride our way through the tough times with all the rate hikes. Well, if you look at the latest figures, that savings buffer is starting to really wind back rather quickly.
So if then, Ian, consumers are starting to spend less, just as the Reserve Bank wanted them to do, why is Philip Lowe warning us there could be still hefty rate rises to come? I mean, he said he would deliver supersized hikes if they're needed.
Yeah. And he's not the only one. The US central bank is saying pretty much the same thing.
We think now is how far to go, and we think there's some ground to cover, but before we meet that test, and that's why we say that ongoing rate increases will be appropriate. We may ultimately move to higher levels than we thought at the time of the September meeting.
Bank of Canada as well. Now, the Bank of Canada, they've come out with these same sets of dire warnings.
We also expect our policy rate will need to increase further. How much further will depend on how monetary policy is working to slow demand, how supply changes supply.
And it's really, I guess, a game of psychology. I mean, economics is really all about psychology. It's a study of human behaviour. It's a study of, to start with, individual behaviour, but then on a macro level, you're looking at mass behaviour and how, messaging starts to impact that behaviour. And one of the key things that they do is essentially it's about expectations. So if you can manage a population's expectations, if you tell them that really tough times are ahead and we might have to really, take some drastic action here, well, the threat of doing that can actually have almost the same impact as actually taking that action. And in this case, it would be raising interest rates. In the industry, it's called the jawbone. So you get out there and you start warning people that things are going to get really bad, and that really scares the horses, and everybody just pulls back and stops the spending. And it's much easier to reverse that kind of position than it is to keep pushing interest rates higher and then have to wind them back and then wait, another 6 to 12 months before that impact starts to unwind,
So if everyone thinks there's going to be supersized rate increases like Philip Lowe is warning, they'll behave accordingly. It's basically self-fulfilling, so he doesn't have to raise interest rates. We're all just scared he's going to raise interest rates. It sounds like things could potentially all backfire with that plan.
Look, I think it's a really smart way to do it at the moment. They've taken pretty drastic action, and they don't know the extent of the full extent of the effects yet. And it could what they've done already might be enough to really tip the economy into some tough times. So they're being very, very careful now about how much further they push it. It's a bit like, I guess parents and children. I mean, a lot of parents, make dire threats to their kids about you do that and you just wait and see what will happen. And that can often be enough to alter the behaviour of the children rather than simply taking that drastic action. It's a very similar kind of situation. So I think it's the right way to go at the moment. And it's just rather interesting that both Canada and America are following Australia's lead in that regard.
So playing similar mind games with us all. I guess, Ian, what we really want to know, though, is are things going to get better and how soon will they get better, or are things going to get worse first?
Look, I think they had to raise interest rates at some stage. The problem we've got, though, is the speed at which they're doing it. I mean, you know, they've suddenly been caught out by this sudden surge in inflation, and they've had to take drastic action to try and get it under control. I think there's probably going to be one or two more interest rate rises, but I think you'll find that by next year, the Reserve Bank will really start to wind it back. They'll sit around for a couple of months and see what kind of impact this is all going to have. If they have to raise it again, they probably will, but it'll be much more gradual than what we've seen in the past couple of months. And I think you'll find that they'll be using ever more threats of taking drastic action in the future than actually taking those actions.
And what happens, Ian, if they have overstepped the mark? They've put rates up too quickly.
It's, I think, the right thing to do at the moment to try and back off a little bit, because the last thing you really want to do is start overdoing the rate hikes and tip the economy into recession when you really didn't need to. Who knows where it's going to go there? Have we gone too hard? We'll know in about 6 months' time, I guess.
Ian Verrender is the ABC's business editor. The Commonwealth Bank has predicted there will be one more 0.25% interest rate rise this year before the RBA begins to cut rates again next year. This episode was produced by Flint Duxfield and Chris Dengate, who also did the mix. Our supervising producer this week is Sydney Peat. I'm Sam Hawley. Don't forget to take our listener survey. The link is in the show notes. ABC News Daily will be back again tomorrow. Thanks for listening.
Subscribe to listen to more free podcasts or download the ABC Listen app and stream ad-free.